On the busy streets of the city, a boy in torn jeans and a gray hoodie sat quietly against the wall. His gaze was distant, carrying a sadness far too old for his young face. As a wealthy couple passed by, the woman in red stopped suddenly, her hand tightening on the millionaire's arm. With trembling voice, she whispered, "He resembles your late son." In that instant, the air froze. The man's world, carefully built on wealth and control, began to crumble with a single look. What he was about to discover would not only shake his pride, but also redefine what family truly meant. And before we begin, let me wish you peace and health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? On a crisp autumn afternoon in Salem, the town square glowed with the kind of charm that only October could bring. Red and gold leaves swirled lazily in the air, landing on the cobblestone paths that wound around old brick buildings. Street musicians strummed soft folk tunes, and the faint smell of pumpkin bread drifted from the bakery at the corner. Couples strolled hand in hand, stopping now and then to drop a few coins into tip jars. The square had the sort of timeless feel that drew tourists year after year. Yet for Jonathan Pierce, it was nothing more than a place he passed through on his way back to Boston. Or at least, that was what he thought. Jonathan stood beside Lydia Monroe, his fiancée, just outside a small diner where the bell above the door rang each time someone went in or out. He had promised her a quiet weekend away from the boardrooms and deadlines that usually defined his life. But as they paused at the edge of the square, Lydia's gaze locked on something across the street. She reached for Jonathan's sleeve, her voice low, almost trembling as she whispered, "Jonathan, he looks just like your son." "Oh." Jonathan followed her eyes. There, by the fountain at the center of the square, stood a boy no older than 12. His jacket was too thin for the chill in the air, and he held a bundle of small flowers, their petals already wilting. He offered them shyly to passers-by, his voice polite but quiet. Some ignored him. A few kind souls reached into their pockets, handing him coins or a folded dollar bill. The boy smiled faintly each time, though those eyes seemed far older than his years. Jonathan froze. His breath caught as though Lydia's words had unlocked a door he had kept shut for too long. He wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, as a trick of autumn light. Yet something in the boy's face, the way he tilted his head, the haunted look in his gaze, sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. It had been years since he had lost his son, years since the funeral where silence weighed heavier than words. He had buried not only a child but also the part of himself that could still feel. He forced a laugh, brittle and short. "You're imagining things," he told Lydia, his voice clipped. But even as he said it, he couldn't stop looking at the boy. He couldn't shake the feeling that the past was staring back at him from across the cobblestones. The boy, Ethan Cross, though Jonathan did not yet know his name, moved with quiet dignity despite the weariness in his step. A young couple stopped, hesitated, then bought a flower for $1. They handed him change, and the boy bowed his head slightly, whispering, "Thank you." He tucked the coin carefully into his pocket, as if it were treasure. Jonathan noticed the way Ethan's hands shook a little from the cold, and something inside him twisted. He told himself it was pity, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it was something else, something he wasn't ready to name. Lydia watched him closely. "Jonathan," she said softly, "are you all right?" He nodded too quickly, the motion sharp. He was a man used to control, to never showing weakness. But as he tried to look away, the boy lifted his head, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. It was like a ghost had stepped into daylight. Jonathan felt his heart lurch in his chest, as if time had folded in on itself. He could see, just for that moment, the boy he had buried years ago. He turned abruptly, muttering something about needing coffee. Lydia didn't press. She simply followed him toward Old Town Roasters, the cafe at the corner where the scent of cinnamon drifted through the door. But Jonathan's thoughts were no longer his own. Lydia's whisper echoed in his ears. "He looks just like your son." And those eyes, those impossible familiar eyes, would not let him go. Inside the cafe, the warmth of roasted beans and the hum of conversation wrapped around them. Jonathan ordered 2 coffees, sliding a few bills across the counter. The barista, a young man with freckles, greeted him with a casual, "Hi, folks," and Jonathan gave a stiff nod. Lydia smiled politely, her eyes still troubled, as she slipped $1 into the tip jar. Jonathan noticed she always tipped, even if service was poor. "It's the right thing to do," she had told him once. For some reason, that small gesture now reminded him of the boy outside. They sat by the window. Lydia stirred sugar into her coffee, glancing out at the square. Jonathan followed her gaze. Ethan had moved closer to the fountain, his flowers nearly gone. The fountain's water shimmered under the late afternoon light, coins glittering at the bottom. A tourist couple tossed in a penny, whispering wishes. Jonathan wondered bitterly what a boy like Ethan would wish for. A warm coat, a steady meal, or perhaps something no penny could buy a family. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He hated how much the boy unsettled him. He hated the way memories surged back, his son's laughter echoing in the backyard, the smell of baseball mitts left out in the sun, the soft, "Good night," Dad whispered at the bedroom door. Those were ghosts now, wrapped in silence and regret. Yet here was this stranger, this boy, on the square, tearing open wounds Jonathan had spent years sealing shut. "Jonathan," Lydia said gently, "you don't have to pretend with me. I saw the way you looked at him." He bristled. "I told you. It's nothing." But his voice lacked conviction, and Lydia's expression told him she knew it. She reached across the table, touching his hand. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the past finds its way back to us. Not to hurt us, but to heal us." Jonathan pulled his hand back, staring into his coffee. He didn't want healing. Healing meant admitting he was still broken. Outside, Ethan offered his last flower to an older woman bundled in a scarf. She took it with a smile, pressing a coin into his palm. The boy bowed his head again, polite as ever, then sat at the edge of the fountain, clutching the money like it might slip away. Jonathan couldn't stop watching. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but deep down he knew better. He felt drawn to the boy as if some invisible thread pulled at his chest. As the evening shadows lengthened, Jonathan and Lydia left the cafe. The air carried the distant sound of church bells, the kind that made the town feel timeless. Jonathan's steps slowed near the fountain. Ethan looked up, and once more their eyes met. It was brief, but powerful. For a moment, the world hushed. The street musicians paused between songs. The chatter of the square faded, and Jonathan felt only the weight of those eyes haunted, familiar, impossible to ignore. He turned sharply, almost stumbling, his voice low and rough. "It can't be, but those eyes—" The next morning, the square was alive in a different way. Vendors rolled open their carts, setting out baskets of apples and jars of honey. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted in the crisp air, mingling with the sound of bells from a nearby church. Salem had a rhythm of its own, steady and familiar to the townsfolk. But for Jonathan Pierce, it was all foreign. He wasn't here for charm or comfort. He was here because of a boy he couldn't stop thinking about. All night, Lydia's words had echoed in his mind. "He looks just like your son." He had tried to dismiss it, tried to lose himself in a glass of scotch, in reports waiting on his laptop, in the silence of the hotel room. But the boy's eyes haunted, familiar, had followed him even in dreams. By dawn, Jonathan made a decision. He would go back. He told himself it was curiosity. Nothing more. A businessman's instinct to investigate. But beneath that excuse pulsed something far more dangerous. Hope. He arrived just as the square began to fill. There was Ethan again, standing near the fountain, his thin jacket zipped up to his chin. He greeted strangers with a shy nod, holding out flowers no fresher than yesterday. Some passed him by without a glance. A few kind-hearted souls dropped coins into his small tin can. Jonathan studied him from a distance, his jaw set, his hands in his pockets. Then, with the deliberate calm of a man who built deals out of tests and gambits, he crafted a plan. He took his leather wallet, thick and polished, and placed it neatly on a bench a few steps away. He walked on, slow enough that anyone could see. He didn't look back, but every fiber of him was listening, waiting. Would the boy pocket it? Would he hesitate? Jonathan wanted to know not just about the wallet, but about the boy's soul. Minutes passed. Jonathan leaned against a lamppost, pretending to check his phone. His pulse quickened when he saw Ethan glance at the bench. The boy shifted, uncertain. He looked left, right, then slowly approached. His small hand hovered over the wallet. For an instant, Jonathan thought he would take it and run. But then, Ethan drew back, biting his lip, as though wrestling with something unseen. Finally, He picked it up carefully, holding it with both hands as though it were fragile. Jonathan's breath caught. The boy walked straight toward him. When he reached him, Ethan held the wallet out, eyes steady though his hands trembled from the cold. "Sir," he said softly, "you dropped this." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "How do you know it's mine?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Ethan hesitated, then answered, "Because you're the only one who sat there. Nobody else even noticed." His voice was quiet but certain, with the kind of clarity only honesty could give. Jonathan took the wallet, weighing its unexpected return. "You didn't even open it?" he pressed. Ethan shook his head firmly. "My grandma always told me what isn't yours can never make you full." The words struck Jonathan like a blow. He heard them not in Ethan's voice, but in another Maggie's. It was something she once said long ago, in a kitchen filled with sunlight, when she scolded him for being careless with money. His chest tightened. He hadn't heard those words in years. Yet here they were, spoken by a boy who looked at him with eyes too familiar. Jonathan's voice softened despite himself. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, then said, "Ethan Cross." The name hung in the air, plain and simple, but to Jonathan it carried a weight he couldn't yet understand. Jonathan repeated the name under his breath, as if testing its weight. "Ethan," he said slowly, letting the syllables settle. The boy looked uneasy, shifting his feet on the cobblestones, but he didn't run. Jonathan slipped the wallet back into his coat pocket, studying him. "Do you sell flowers here every day?" he asked. Ethan gave a small nod. "After school, when I can. Sometimes in the mornings, too, if my aunt feels well enough to let me go out." His words carried the careful caution of a child who had learned to measure trust. Jonathan considered pressing further, but something in Ethan's face made him hold back. He remembered being a boy himself once, navigating grown-ups who asked too many questions. "Instead," he said lightly, "flowers don't last long this time of year. You must have to work twice as hard to sell them." Ethan shrugged. "They don't last, but people still buy them. For the colors, for remembering." He looked down at the empty stems in his hand. "Even if they fade fast, they make somebody smile for a while. That's worth it." The simplicity of the answer caught Jonathan off guard. He had spent decades chasing permanence buildings, contracts, legacies that couldn't crumble. And yet here was a boy telling him that even fleeting beauty had value. He felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. From the corner of his eye, Jonathan saw Lydia standing near the cafe. She had followed at a distance, letting him take the lead. Her expression was soft, almost wistful, as though she recognized something in Jonathan that he himself could not admit. She offered a faint smile, then turned away, leaving him to this quiet moment. Jonathan cleared his throat. "You're an honest boy, Ethan. Not many would have returned this." Ethan lowered his gaze. "Grandma says honesty is the only thing you can't buy back once you lose it." The words again sounded like Maggie's voice. Jonathan's grip on the wallet tightened. Memories surged. A woman laughing in the sunlight, her hand brushing his as she arranged daisies in a jar. He had buried those memories, but now they clawed their way back, alive in this child's quiet wisdom. A silence stretched between them. The bustle of the square went on, vendors calling out prices, a dog barking at pigeons, children laughing as they chased each other, but for Jonathan, it all faded. It was only him, the boy, and a past that refused to stay buried. At last, Ethan shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the stillness. "I should go," he murmured, tucking the last of his coins into his pocket. Jonathan almost let him walk away. Almost. But something stopped him. He reached out, not touching, but with his voice. "Ethan," he said, "we'll see each other again." Ethan looked back, puzzled, then gave a small nod before disappearing into the crowd, his thin frame swallowed by the flow of people. Jonathan stood frozen by the fountain, the leather wallet heavy in his pocket, his heart heavier still. He told himself it had been nothing more than a test, a curiosity satisfied. Yet the boy's words echoed in his mind. "What isn't yours can never make you full." And Jonathan knew deep down that this encounter was no accident. Jonathan stared after him, stunned. The boy's words sounded exactly like Maggie's voice from years ago. That night, Jonathan lay awake in his hotel room overlooking the harbor. The glow of Boston's skyline reflected faintly off the window, but his mind was fixed a few miles away, on the boy in the square. He turned from side to side, the sheets tangling around him, until finally he gave up on sleep altogether. The memory of Ethan's words returned again and again. What isn't yours can never make you full. It was uncanny how closely they matched Maggie's voice, as if she herself had whispered them into the night. By morning, Jonathan found himself drawn back to Salem. Lydia noticed his restlessness but didn't question him. She had learned that Jonathan, proud as he was, needed time to name his feelings. So she let him go, with nothing more than a gentle reminder. Be kind, Jonathan, even if you don't know why yet. The streets were damp with rain when he arrived. Water pooled between cobblestones, and the smell of wet leaves lingered in the air. Old Town Roasters, the cafe by the square, glowed with its familiar brick walls and steamy windows. Jonathan pushed open the door, the bell overhead chiming softly. The warmth inside wrapped around him freshly ground beans, cinnamon muffins cooling on a rack, and the murmur of neighbors sharing morning news. He spotted Ethan at the far corner, clutching a paper cup of hot cocoa with both hands. His thin jacket was darker now from the rain, and his hair stuck damply to his forehead. Jonathan approached slowly, sliding into the chair across from him without asking. The boy startled, but didn't flee. He just stared with those guarded eyes. I took the liberty of buying you something warmer, Jonathan said, signaling the waitress. A muffin, maybe? Ethan shook his head quickly, embarrassed. I don't need it. But Jonathan caught the way his eyes lingered on the tray of blueberry muffins near the counter. He ordered one anyway, placing it gently in front of the boy. Eat. It's on me. Ethan hesitated, then took a small bite, as if afraid it might be taken away. They sat in silence for a while. The rain tapped against the windows, and Jonathan found himself studying the boy more closely than before. The shape of his jaw, the tilt of his head, it was all so achingly familiar. Finally, Jonathan leaned forward. Tell me about your family, he said softly. Ethan froze, eyes dropping to the table. His fingers fiddled with the paper cup. It's just me and Aunt Eleanor, he said after a long pause. Grandma passed a while back. Mom. His voice trailed, breaking slightly. Then, almost reluctantly, he reached into his worn backpack. He pulled out a folded photograph, edges frayed, the image faded with time. He laid it on the table between them. Jonathan's breath caught. It was Maggie, her brown hair pulled back, her smile radiant, exactly as he remembered her. For a moment, the world around him blurred the chatter of the cafe, the smell of cinnamon, even the rain outside, all of it dissolved into the face, staring up at him from that worn photograph. His hand trembled as he touched the edge of the picture. Where did you get this? His voice was husky, strained. Ethan looked up, meeting his gaze. She was my mom, Maggie Cross. She kept this photo of you. She always said, one day I should find the man in it. Jonathan's throat tightened. The cafe around him seemed to fall silent, as if the entire town were holding its breath. He lifted the photo carefully, afraid it might dissolve in his hands. Maggie's smile leapt out of the faded image, tender and familiar. It was the same smile that once welcomed him on long summer evenings, when they would walk the quiet streets of Concord and dream about futures that never came to be. She kept this? Jonathan whispered, almost to himself. Ethan nodded. Always. She told me that if I ever felt lost, I should look for the man in this picture. She said he was important, even if he didn't know it yet. The words pierced Jonathan like a blade wrapped in velvet, gentle, but cutting deep. He set the photo down, staring at the boy in front of him. Ethan's small hands wrapped around the cocoa cup, his shoulders hunched as if expecting rejection. Jonathan felt an ache in his chest, one he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. He swallowed hard. How long ago did she pass? Ethan lowered his eyes. 2 years. Aunt Eleanor says it was her heart. She tried to be strong, but she got sick fast. His voice faltered, and he pressed his lips together, as though holding back tears. Jonathan reached across the table, hesitated, then rested his hand gently over the boy's. The gesture startled Ethan, but he didn't pull away. I knew your mother, Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Long ago, when we were young. She was extraordinary. Ethan's eyes widened. You did? Jonathan nodded, the weight of memory pressing down on him. He wanted to say more, to confess everything, how much he had loved her, how much he had lost, but the words caught in his throat. The waitress came by, refilling Jonathan's coffee. She glanced at Ethan with a kind smile, then moved on, leaving the two of them suspended in their fragile connection. Outside, the rain eased into a soft drizzle, the square shimmering with puddles that reflected the glow of street lamps. Ethan reached into his backpack again and pulled out a small envelope. She wrote letters sometimes. I don't understand them all, but she always signed them with your name. She said they were for you, if I ever found you. He slid the envelope across the table. Jonathan's heart pounded as he picked it up. It was sealed, the paper fragile from years of being carried. His name, Jonathan, was written in Maggie's familiar hand. He couldn't open it. Not yet. His hand shook too much, and the cafe suddenly felt too small, too crowded. He slipped the envelope into his coat pocket, close to his chest. He forced a smile at the boy, though his eyes burned. "Thank you," he murmured. Ethan gave a faint nod, still unsure what to make of the man before him. Jonathan knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary meeting, no chance encounter. Fate, memory, and truth had collided in the quiet corner of a Salem cafe. The rain outside slowed to a mist as Jonathan stared at the photograph once more. Maggie's face, Ethan's presence, the sealed letter in his pocket. It was all too much, and yet not nearly enough. Ethan's voice broke the silence, trembling but firm. "Mom said one day I'd find the man in this picture. She wanted me to know him." Jonathan's hand closed around the photograph, his heart hammering. He whispered, almost in disbelief, "Maggie." Jonathan couldn't shake the image of the faded photograph or the weight of the sealed envelope in his coat pocket. For years, he had told himself the past was buried, that Maggie belonged to another life. Yet here he was, staring at proof that time hadn't erased her at all. The boy Ethan was the living echo of choices he never knew he made. Rain still clung to the narrow streets of Salem as Jonathan left the cafe. The air smelled of wet brick and salt from the harbor. His driver pulled up in a sleek black sedan, but Jonathan didn't climb in. Instead, he found himself walking aimlessly through the town, past bookshops with creaking signs and corner diners with their neon lights flickering to life. He ended up at an old apartment building with ivy crawling up its faded red walls. He didn't know why he stopped there, until the door opened and a woman stepped out with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Eleanor Cross, older now, with silver threads in her dark hair and lines etched deep around her eyes, but unmistakable, Maggie's sister. Jonathan felt his heart stumble. He hadn't seen her in decades, not since the days when Maggie would bring him to family picnics by the river. Eleanor froze when she saw him. For a moment neither spoke. Then her voice, low and wary. "Jonathan Pierce. I wondered how long it would take." Jonathan swallowed hard. "You knew I'd come?" She nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "You saw Ethan. I could tell from the way he looked yesterday when he came home. There was something different in his eyes. He's a terrible liar, you know, just like his mother." A faint smile flickered, then died as quickly as it appeared. Jonathan stepped closer. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why did Maggie? Why did you keep him from me?" His voice cracked despite his effort to stay controlled. Eleanor's expression hardened. "Because Maggie wanted to protect him. And maybe to protect you too. You weren't ready, Jonathan. Back then, all you cared about was your career, your empire. Maggie knew you wouldn't choose them both. And when she got sick, she made me promise." Eleanor stopped, her jaw tightening. Jonathan's chest ached. "She made you promise to hide my own son from me?" Her eyes softened, but her tone stayed firm. "She made me promise to give him a stable life, to keep him safe from a father who might see him as a burden instead of a blessing. You may not want to hear that, but that's the truth, as she saw it." Jonathan staggered under the words. A burden. He thought of the countless meetings, the skyscrapers with his name etched into marble, the trophies of a life spent building higher and higher. And yet, here was the cost. A boy who had grown up without him, a woman who had carried that weight alone, and a sister who had kept the secret until now. "I would have chosen differently," Jonathan said hoarsely. "If I had known—" Eleanor cut him off, her voice sharp. "Would you? Or would you have kept chasing your next deal while Maggie carried everything on her own?" The truth stung because he had no answer. For once, Jonathan Pierce, the man who always had the right words, stood silent in the Salem night, with only the sound of rain dripping from the eaves to fill the space between them. Jonathan steadied himself, trying to find words, but Eleanor had already turned toward the doorway. He followed, and after a long pause, she let him in. The apartment was modest but clean, the scent of vegetable soup still lingering in the air. On the mantel sat framed photos. Maggie as a girl, Eleanor with a broad smile at some long-forgotten family picnic, and Ethan at different ages, his eyes always shadowed, yet bright with determination. Jonathan's gaze fixed on a larger portrait, Maggie holding Ethan as a baby. She looked tired but radiant, her arms wrapped around the child as if nothing else in the world mattered. Jonathan reached out instinctively, fingertips brushing the frame. His throat tightened, and he whispered, "He should have known me. He should have had a father." Eleanor folded her arms, and yet he didn't, because Maggie believed it was safer that way. She never stopped caring for you, Jonathan, but she didn't trust the life you built. She wanted Ethan to grow up free from disappointment. Jonathan turned, his face lined with regret. "You think I would have abandoned him?" Eleanor met his eyes evenly. "I think you would have chosen differently. You've always been a man who puts buildings before people, contracts before commitments. Maggie saw it, I saw it, but maybe you're here now because something in you has changed." Silence fell heavy between them. Jonathan walked to the window, looking down at the wet cobblestones glistening under the streetlights. He could hear Ethan's laughter faintly in his mind, though he had never been there to witness it. He pressed a hand against the glass, as if trying to bridge a distance that years had carved. At last, Eleanor's voice softened. "He's a good boy, Jonathan. Strong, but lonely. He needs someone steady. If you really want to be part of his life, prove it. Not to me, not even to Maggie's memory, but to him." Jonathan turned back, his jaw firm, though his eyes glistened. "I will," he said simply. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she moved to a small wooden box on the shelf, lifting it with careful hands. She opened it to reveal a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. These were Maggie's. She wrote them during the years she raised Ethan. Some are for him. Some, I think she meant for you. Jonathan reached for the letters, his fingers trembling. Holding them felt like holding Maggie's voice again, alive and near. His chest tightened with a rush of sorrow and gratitude. As he tucked the bundle carefully under his arm, Eleanor's voice carried through the quiet room. "But Jonathan, don't think a few words on paper will make up for 12 lost years. You can't rewrite the past. You can only choose what you do now." Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. He walked out into the night, with the letters against his chest, the rain now little more than mist. The square lay silent, its fountain reflecting the dim glow of the lampposts. In his pocket, the unopened envelope from Ethan burned like a secret yet to be faced. And deep inside, Jonathan knew the truth. This was no longer about a boy in the square. It was about a life he had missed, and a second chance he wasn't sure he deserved. Jonathan Pierce sat alone in his penthouse, the kind of place people dreamed of. Glass walls, a sweeping view of Boston Harbor, and furniture, polished until it gleamed. Yet that night it felt less like home and more like a museum of emptiness. The lights of the city blinked below, but inside, silence ruled. On the mahogany table before him rested the bundle of letters Eleanor had entrusted to him. The ribbon binding them together was thin, almost translucent with age, as if it might snap at the slightest touch. He had carried them from Salem like a relic, close to his chest the entire drive back, his mind a storm of disbelief and dread. He poured himself a whiskey, amber liquid swirling in the glass, but after one sip he set it aside. Alcohol couldn't steady him now. His hand hovered over the letters for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a breath that came out more like a sigh, he untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated 12 years earlier, written in Maggie's steady, looping hand. "Jonathan," it began, "by the time you see these words, years will have passed. I wanted to tell you from the beginning, but every time I tried, my courage failed me. I looked at your life, your towers of glass, your awards, the men in suits who followed your every word, and I thought, where would a child fit in that world? Where would I fit?" Jonathan closed his eyes. He remembered those days vividly. The endless nights in conference rooms, the triumph of winning contracts, the pride of seeing his name etched into stone. He had thought it was enough. Yet here, in Maggie's words, was the other side of that story, the cost he had never counted. He read on, the letters trembling in his hands. I told myself I was protecting you, but maybe I was protecting Ethan more. I didn't want him to grow up competing with skyscrapers for your attention, so I chose silence. And yet, every night when I tucked him in, I saw you in his stubborn smile, in the way he argued over bedtime, in the way he dreamed too big for our small apartment. He is yours, Jonathan, whether you ever knew it or not. Jonathan set the letter down, his breath shallow. He pressed a hand against his forehead, but the words burned through anyway. For years, he had believed Maggie had left him behind, uninterested in building a life together. Now he saw the truth. She hadn't stopped loving him. She had doubted he could love them both. He reached for another letter. This one dated several years later. The handwriting was a little messier, hurried, as if written in exhaustion. Ethan asks about you sometimes. He doesn't know your name, but he knows there's someone missing. I tell him you are far away, called by duty, building things bigger than either of us can imagine. He nods. But I see the question in his eyes. I wonder if someday he will look for you. I hope he does. Maybe then you will be ready in a way you weren't when we were young. Jonathan's chest heaved. He had spent his life ensuring every bridge he built could carry weight. Every tower could weather storms. Yet here was a boy carrying the weight of absence, and no structure could fix that. His trembling hand lifted another page, one of the last. The ink was fainter, the handwriting unsteady. If I am gone when you read this, promise me one thing. If Ethan finds you, love him not with guilt, but with hope. Don't try to repay him with gifts or make up for lost time with grand gestures. He doesn't need your wealth, Jonathan. He needs your presence. He deserves a father, not a shadow. And you, perhaps, deserve the chance to be one. Jonathan dropped the page onto the table as if it were fire. His hands covered his face, and for the first time in decades, he wept without restraint. Not the silent, bitter tears he had shed at his son's funeral years ago, but raw sobs that shook him to his core. When the storm inside him eased, he rose and walked to the window. Boston shimmered beneath him, the harbor lights reflecting like restless stars. But he saw none of it. What he saw instead was Maggie laughing in a field of daisies, scolding him for being careless with money, holding a baby in her arms he had never known existed. And then Ethan, standing in the square, clutching flowers too fragile for the autumn cold. Jonathan's reflection in the glass looked older than he felt, lined with regret. He whispered into the night, Maggie, I wasn't there for you, but I'll be there for him. On the table, the unopened envelope Ethan had handed him sat like a stone, heavier than any steel beam Jonathan had ever worked with. He hadn't opened it yet. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew this. The moment he did, nothing in his life would remain the same. He returned to the table, gathered the letters carefully, and retied the ribbon. His fingers lingered on them, reluctant to let go. Then he placed them back into the box Eleanor had given him. They weren't just words on paper. They were Maggie's voice, carrying across time, urging him not to waste the second chance life had placed in his path. As dawn crept into the sky, painting the harbor in pale gold, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. For years he had lived for deadlines, profits, and prestige. Now, for the first time, he wanted to live for someone else. For a boy with haunted eyes and an honesty too rare for his age. For the son he had unknowingly lost and miraculously found. And as the sun rose over Boston, Jonathan Pierce made a vow that would change his life forever. The following Saturday, Jonathan found himself back in Salem, though he hadn't planned it that way. His driver asked if he wanted to be taken to the Boston office, where a dozen meetings awaited, but Jonathan shook his head. Salem, he said simply. The word surprised even him. The town square bustled with weekend life. Vendors sold caramel apples and cider donuts, the sweet aroma filling the crisp autumn air. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, begging for pumpkins from the stalls. The old church bell struck noon, and pigeons scattered into the clear sky. It was the kind of scene Jonathan might once have walked past without a second thought, but now it held him still. He spotted Ethan near the fountain, setting up a small table with dog-eared paperbacks stacked in uneven piles. A handwritten sign leaned against the stack. Stories, $1 each. The boy's jacket was still thin, but he stood proudly behind the table, his hands arranging the books as though they were treasures. Jonathan's chest tightened at the sight. He approached slowly. "Stories now? Instead of flowers?" he asked. Ethan looked up, startled, then gave a shy smile. "The library was giving these away. I thought maybe people would want them. Everyone needs a story, right?" Jonathan's lips curved, faint but genuine. "That's true. Everyone does." He picked up a worn copy of Tom Sawyer, flipping through the yellowed pages. "How much?" Ethan shrugged. $1. Or whatever people can give. Sometimes they just want to talk more than buy. Jonathan pulled a 10 from his wallet and set it on the table. Ethan's eyes widened. "That's too much." "Call it an investment," Jonathan said, slipping the book under his arm. "In you." They walked together toward a bench under the shade of a maple tree. Red leaves drifted down like sparks around them. For a while, neither spoke. Jonathan studied the boy's profile, the curve of his nose, the way he squinted against the sunlight. Every detail seemed to echo Maggie. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You knew my mom, didn't you?" Jonathan's heart lurched. He nodded slowly. "Yes, a long time ago." Ethan's small hands tightened around the book he carried. His voice was quiet, almost fearful. "She told me, if I ever found you, I should trust you. But I don't know what that means. Are you family?" The question struck Jonathan like a blow. He wanted to answer yes immediately, but the words caught in his throat. Years of absence weighed on him. What right did he have to claim family now? Yet, when he looked into Ethan's searching eyes, he knew silence wasn't enough. "I should have been there," Jonathan said at last, his voice rough. "I didn't know about you, Ethan. Not until recently. But if you'll let me, I want to be here now." The boy studied him, suspicion and longing warring in his gaze. Then, after a long pause, Ethan whispered the words Jonathan would never forget. "Would you ever want me to live with you, Dad?" The word Dad hung in the crisp autumn air, more powerful than any contract Jonathan had ever signed, more binding than any oath he had ever taken. He felt his breath falter, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to face the boy beside him. Ethan's eyes darted downward, afraid he had said too much. His shoulders hunched, as though ready for rejection. Jonathan saw the fragility in that posture, the weight of a child who had learned not to expect too much from anyone. It tore at him. Jonathan leaned forward, voice unsteady. "Ethan," he began slowly, "those words, they mean more to me than you know." He paused, pressing a hand to his chest. "I can't change the years we lost. I can't bring back the time I should have been there. But yes, I want you in my life. Not just as a visitor, not just sometimes truly." Ethan lifted his head, hope flickering in his eyes, though caution still held him back. "You mean, like a real home?" Jonathan nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, a home. With dinners together, arguments about homework, weekend walks, all the things I missed with you. If you'll let me, I want to build that now." For a moment, the boy said nothing. He stared at the maple leaves drifting down around them, as if testing whether this promise was real or just another fleeting autumn moment. Then, quietly, he asked, "What about Aunt Eleanor? She's sick sometimes, but she's always been there for me." Jonathan's heart softened further. "She'll always be part of our family. We'll take care of her too. This isn't about leaving her behind. It's about making sure you have more people to lean on, not fewer." Ethan exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight. "Mom always said hope was lighter than absence. I didn't really understand, but maybe now I do." His voice cracked on the last word, and Jonathan reached out, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long while, father and son beneath the maple tree. The sounds of Salem Square bustling around them, vendors calling out prices, children laughing, the bell of the church striking another hour. For Jonathan, the world had narrowed to this one fragile, extraordinary boy who had just given him the title he thought he'd lost forever. As the afternoon waned, Jonathan walked Ethan back to Eleanor's apartment. The building's bricks glowed in the golden light of sunset. Eleanor met them at the door, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes narrowed as she saw Jonathan with his hand resting protectively on Ethan's back. "Is this wise?" she asked, her voice low, wary. Jonathan met her gaze firmly, no hesitation this time. "It's not about wise, Eleanor. It's about right. He deserves a father, and I intend to be one." Eleanor searched his face, measuring his resolve. At last, she stepped aside, letting them in. Ethan darted to the small kitchen, chattering for the first time in days, telling his aunt about the maple leaves, the books he had sold, and the man who had called him honest. Eleanor listened, her expression torn between caution and relief. Jonathan remained by the doorway, Maggie's unopened envelope still burning in his pocket. Tonight, he thought, he would finally open it. But first, he looked toward Ethan, who turned and smiled at him with a brightness that cut straight through the years of absence. Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. The air in Salem carried the unmistakable scent of autumn-spiced cider simmering in kettles, fresh hay bales stacked along the sidewalks, and caramel apples glistening under festival lights. The annual Fall Festival had always been a highlight for the town, drawing families to the square for music, games, and stories read aloud by local children. Jonathan had attended countless galas and corporate events in Boston, but never anything like this. Instead of tuxedos and champagne, here were plaid shirts, wool sweaters, and thermoses of hot chocolate. Instead of silent auctions and stiff conversations, here were pies cooling on tables and children racing toward the pumpkin carving contest. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt the tension in his shoulders loosen. He stood near the gazebo, strung with twinkling lights, watching Ethan from a distance. The boy wore a pressed blue shirt, his hair neatly combed to one side. Eleanor must have helped. Jonathan silently made a note to thank her. Ethan clutched a small folder of papers, his lips moving silently as if rehearsing. Lydia appeared beside Jonathan, handing him a steaming cup of cider. "He's nervous," she said softly, nodding toward Ethan. "But I've never seen him so alive." Jonathan's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and fear. He had spent his life making presentations before boards and investors. But seeing his son stand ready to share a story, felt like the most important event of all. The festival host, a kindly older man with a wide-brimmed hat, tapped the microphone. "Next, we have a young storyteller. Please welcome Ethan Cross." The crowd applauded warmly. Ethan walked onto the small stage, clutching his folder with trembling hands. Jonathan's breath caught as the boy adjusted the microphone. His voice was quiet at first, but it steadied as he began. "This is a story I wrote about an old tree," Ethan said. "A tree that lost a branch long ago, but one day a seed returned to grow beside it. The tree thought it was broken forever, but the seed reminded it that it could still be whole again." Jonathan's throat tightened. The parable was simple, but the meaning was clear. It wasn't just a story, it was their story. The crowd listened attentively, nodding as Ethan read about storms weathered, roots deepened, and the promise of new beginnings. A hush fell when he ended with, "Sometimes what we think is gone forever is really just waiting to return, stronger than before." Applause erupted. Jonathan clapped harder than anyone, his eyes wet. As Ethan left the stage, he glanced toward Jonathan. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for the first time, Ethan didn't look away. He smiled, small but radiant, before running off to join his classmates. Lydia placed a hand on Jonathan's arm. "Do you see it now? You were meant to be here for him." Jonathan nodded, unable to speak, but the moment of warmth carried with it a tremor of fear. Because deep inside, Jonathan knew, when a boy calls a man dad before a crowd, there is no turning back. As the sun dipped lower, lanterns flickered to life around the square. Families gathered near the bandstand where fiddles and guitars played lively folk tunes. The smell of roasted corn and cinnamon sugar donuts filled the air. Children darted between booths, their laughter ringing like bells. Jonathan stood at the edge of it all, feeling strangely out of place and perfectly at home at the same time. He had spent decades building towers of steel and glass, yet here among bales of hay, carved pumpkins, and paper lanterns he discovered something far sturdier: belonging. Ethan returned from the stage, still clutching his folder. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes brighter than Jonathan had ever seen. He stopped in front of him, nervous, then asked softly, "Did I do okay?" Jonathan bent down slightly, his voice thick with emotion. You didn't just do okay, Ethan. You made me proud. More proud than I can ever say. Ethan's lips parted as if to reply, but instead he reached into the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. I drew this last night. It's us. You, me, and Mom. He handed it over, shy but hopeful. Jonathan unfolded the paper. There it was. A child's drawing of 3 figures sitting on a bench under a big tree, sunlight spilling down over them. His breath caught, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He touched the drawing with reverence, as though it were a priceless blueprint. "Thank you," Jonathan whispered, his throat tight. This means everything." Ethan shifted his weight, then glanced around nervously. The crowd was still bustling, but for the boy it seemed to vanish into silence. He looked up at Jonathan and said in a voice that trembled but carried, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." The word cut through Jonathan's chest like light through darkness. His eyes blurred, but he didn't hide it. He pulled Ethan close, holding him as tightly as if he might never let go. The crowd moved around them, unaware of the enormity of the moment, but for Jonathan it was as though the world had stopped. Nearby, Lydia wiped her eyes. Even Eleanor, standing at a distance with her shawl wrapped tight, allowed herself a small, weary smile. For Jonathan, it was the first time in years that he didn't feel like an architect of stone, but like a man rebuilt from within. And yet, as the evening wound down, a thought lingered like a shadow. Maggie's unopened letter still waited in his coat pocket. A letter that might hold truths he wasn't ready to face. The morning after the festival, Salem Square was quiet again. Hay bales still lined the sidewalks, and bits of confetti clung to the cobblestones, reminders of the joy that had filled the night. Jonathan sat on a park bench near the fountain, his coat buttoned against the chill, one hand buried deep in his pocket. His fingers brushed against the envelope that had weighed on him for days, the one Ethan had given him, written in Maggie's hand. He had carried it through meetings, dinners, and restless nights, too afraid to open it. But now, with the sun breaking gently through the clouds, he finally tore the seal. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. "Jonathan," the letter began, "if Ethan has given this to you, then he is old enough to understand what I could never say aloud. Forgive me for my silence. Forgive me for not trusting you with the truth when it mattered most." Jonathan's eyes blurred, but he forced himself to continue. "You were always chasing horizons, always building higher. I loved that about you. But I also feared it. I feared there would be no room in your world for a child, no room for the messy, beautiful interruptions of family. So I carried that choice alone. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I should have believed in you. But Jonathan believed this. I never stopped believing in us." Tears slid down Jonathan's face. He bowed his head, letting the words settle into the silence around him. The letter continued. "Ethan is strong, but strength can be lonely. He will need you, not as the man who signs, checks, or commands a boardroom, but as a father who listens, who laughs, who stays. If you choose him with your whole heart. Don't let guilt be the language you speak to him. Let it be love. That is my only promise to ask of you." Jonathan folded the letter carefully, pressing it against his chest. "I promise, Maggie," he whispered, his voice breaking. Later that week, Jonathan stood before a crowd gathered in Boston. It wasn't in a boardroom or at a shareholders' meeting, but at the unveiling of a new initiative he had poured himself into over sleepless nights, the Maggie Cross Foundation. The banner above the stage bore Maggie's name, flanked by autumn leaves. Reporters scribbled notes, and townsfolk from Salem had come by bus. But Jonathan's eyes sought only one face, Ethan, sitting in the front row with Eleanor and Lydia. The boy's expression was a mix of pride and wonder. Jonathan stepped up to the microphone. For once, he felt no need for polished speeches or rehearsed lines. He simply spoke from his heart. "It is never too late," he began, his voice steady but warm, "to be a father. It is never too late to come home. This foundation is more than bricks and budgets. It's a promise that no child should grow up without knowing they are loved, without knowing they matter." The crowd applauded, but Jonathan barely heard them. His gaze locked on Ethan, who leaned forward, his small hands gripping the edge of his chair. Jonathan paused at the podium, the words catching in his throat. He took a slow breath, remembering Maggie's handwriting, the way her letters had trembled near the end. He let his voice soften. This foundation will build more than shelters and classrooms. It will build second chances for children who feel forgotten, for families who need mending, for fathers like me who learn sometimes too late that nothing we build matters if we cannot share it with those we love. The hall erupted in applause, but Jonathan hardly noticed. His eyes shimmered as he stepped down from the stage. Ethan rose to meet him, clutching a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something too," Ethan said nervously, handing it over. Jonathan unfolded it and found a few simple sentences, written in careful handwriting. "This is my dad. He builds buildings, but he also builds hearts. He built mine back when I thought it was broken. Now we live together, and I'm not afraid anymore." Jonathan's vision blurred. He pulled Ethan into his arms, holding him tightly as if the boy were his anchor in a storm. The crowd quieted, moved by the sight of a powerful man, undone by love. Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Lydia smiled, her hands clasped together in silent gratitude. That evening, back in Salem, Jonathan and Ethan walked home through streets lit by warm lamplight. The autumn air carried the smell of wood smoke, and church bells tolled in the distance. Jonathan carried a paper bag with cider donuts, insisting they celebrate in their own small way. Inside Eleanor's apartment, the three of them gathered around the worn kitchen table. The furniture was humble, but for Jonathan it felt richer than any boardroom table he had ever known. He broke a donut in half and handed it to Ethan, who grinned, sugar dusting his lips. For the first time, Jonathan laughed. Not the polite, calculated laugh he used at networking events, but a real, full laugh that shook his shoulders and lit his eyes. Ethan laughed too, the sound bright and unguarded, and Eleanor sat back in her chair, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "Maggie would be so proud." Later that night, when Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch with the drawing still in his lap, Jonathan stepped out onto the balcony. The sky stretched wide and quiet above, stars faint but steady. He pulled Maggie's letter from his pocket one last time. "I kept my promise," he murmured to the night. "I chose him, Maggie, with my whole heart." And for the first time in decades, Jonathan felt whole himself. The night after the festival, when Jonathan finally read Maggie's letter, something inside him shifted. He had spent decades chasing skylines, signing contracts, and dining under chandeliers, but in those handwritten lines, he discovered that the greatest blueprint he would ever follow was love itself. What had begun as a reluctant encounter with a shy boy on a quiet street ended as the rebirth of a father, humbled and remade by the gentle strength of family. For those of us listening, perhaps the story lingers because it reminds us of moments in our own lives, those times when we wished we had said the right words sooner, or hugged someone a little longer before letting go. In Jonathan's journey, we see a man finally brave enough to open the door of his heart, even when the past whispered that it was too late. And maybe that is what makes this story ring true for every season of life. It is never too late to come home. The lesson is simple but profound. Love has the power to repair what pride once broke. Redemption is not found in wealth or applause, but in small acts of staying, listening, and choosing family. Just as Maggie wrote, "It is not guilt that raises a child, but love." And just as Jonathan learned, the most fragile bonds once tended can become the strongest roots. Think of it this way. Like the steady glow of a porch light on a chilly evening, a single gesture of kindness can guide someone safely back home through the darkest streets. In America, we carry these truths in the small rituals of daily life supper around the kitchen table, the hymns sung softly on Sunday mornings, the smell of pie cooling on the windowsill. These are the quiet moments that remind us, no matter our age, no matter our mistakes, family is the hearth that warms us when the world feels cold. For many who have lived long enough to know loss, the story of Jonathan and Ethan is not just about a father and son, but about all of us who need a hand to hold, or a voice to tell us, "You still belong." So tonight, dear friends, take a moment to reflect. Is there someone waiting for your call? Someone hoping you'll walk back through the door? Sometimes the path to forgiveness is not paved with grand speeches, but with the courage to sit, to listen, and to stay. Happiness comes not when we build higher towers, but when we share a roof and a table, when we choose one another again and again. And as we close this story, let me leave you with a gentle thought. Life gives us only so many autumns, only so many chances to make things right. Don't let them slip by. If this story touched your heart, let us know by writing a simple 1 in the comments. If you felt it missed the mark, or if you'd like us to do better, write a 0. Because here, every voice matters. Family, after all, is not only about blood, it is about the choice to love, to forgive, and to remain. And sometimes, that choice can change everything.